We're going to switch to online, and the next presenter is Wendy Sandler.
Thank you. Whoa. Are we okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a great opportunity. Today I'm going to talk about diversity. That's the topic of this conference. And basically what I'm going to do is compare spoken languages and sign languages, two forms of natural human language, and make the claim that diversity is not really diversity, that instead it's cognitive elasticity. So human language is an anomaly of nature because humans are the only species with language. Other species communicate, but they don't have language by any reasonable definition of language. But we have two kinds of language. We have spoken language and sign language. Much of the early research on sign language was trying to demonstrate how similar the two are, surprisingly. Sign languages have phonology, they have derivation and inflection and morphology, they have prosody, syntax, and all these things that you see up here on the screen have been argued for successfully in sign language. But what I'm saying is, what I would like to say is that this is not the whole story. The main points I want to make are these. In classical linguistics, diversity was really important, looking at diversity among human languages and language families. And I would say that one of the main contributions of generative linguistics is that there are core universals across language, even though they seem to vary a lot, there are core universals. But the points I'd like to make here are that sign languages exhibit both core universals, but also substantive differences from spoken language. And what I want to say is that this diversity, that is two types of natural language, is powerful evidence for the unique elasticity of human cognition. So these are the linguistic universals that I'm going to touch on very briefly, just to sort of convince you that sign languages also have them. Symbolism, words symbolize concepts. Duality of patterning, which means that there's a meaningless level, which is we usually call phonology, and a meaningful level, which is quite amazing actually in itself. And the meaningless level allows us to make huge vocabularies. Linear combinatoriality, that is, elements can combine with one another linearly to make more complex elements. Recursion has been a very important one in the last 10 years, I guess, in particular. It's been argued that all languages have recursion. It's a kind of embedding one linguistic element into another element of the same kind. And finally, very recently, well, more recently in the history of study, is multimodality. That is, that language requires gesture. So when you think about this at first, you think, well, how can sign language have gesture if gesture is usually manual when the hands are already very busy signing? I'm going to show you. Let's start with symbolization. Terence Deacon called us a symbolic species. He's right. So here are some signs in Israeli Sign Language, which I'm going to use. Most of my examples will be from Israeli Sign Language. Cat, ask, interesting character. I chose these randomly, but they demonstrate that there are both concrete and abstract symbols in sign languages. And that these are words of sign language, and they have phonological properties and also syntactic properties like the words of spoken language. Duality of patterning is usually demonstrated through minimal pairs, that is, words that are identical with one another except for one element. So mother and noon, you see here, are identical except for hand shape features. The hand shapes are different. Send and tattle are identical, same hand shape, same movement, but different location features. Send is from the chest and tattle is from the mouth. And finally, escape and betray are different because of movement features. Escape has a straight movement and betray has a arced movement. But in all cases, we have a canonical form of the word in sign language. So there's one hand configuration that moves from one location to another. And most sign language linguists consider movement to be a nucleus, syllable nucleus, so that sign language words are overwhelmingly monosyllabic. We're moving quickly to combinatoriality. And the example I'm giving is a very simple one of compounds, where you put two words together to make a new word, and especially lexicalized compounds where the new word goes into the mental lexicon. So we have pan, we have cake, and we have pancake. But in pancake, we no longer think of it as a cake that's made in a cake that's made in a pan. We just think of it as a pancake. And one of the other properties, in addition to the change of meaning from the two individual elements, is that the sound can change. So the N in pancake assimilates the velar place of articulation of the following K, so that we say pancake. And also the stress is different. So a cake that's made in a pan is a pancake, whereas a pancake has the stress in the first syllable. I hope you're with me. In sign languages, we have a similar phenomenon. For example, here's a compound in Israeli Sign Language that consists of the signs think and stop, and together it means shocked. But what happens? The hand configuration, the hand shape, assimilates from the second sign, stop, onto the whole compound, and there is only one movement as a result. So that we have shocked looks like this, and it conforms to the canonical form of a word in sign language, one hand configuration, and the hand moves from one location to another. We also have recursion. I'm going to show you this sentence, which is going to become very familiar to you throughout the course of this talk. I'm only going to show it to you now so that you can see that there's a relative clause inside this longer sentence. And the relative clause is that I found last week. So she says, the little dog that I found last week ran away. And here's what it looks like. So these are some of the properties that are shared by sign languages. Another one is gestures. Well, you think the hands are pretty busy, but how are they going to be able to express gestures? These are what Efron and Kendon call emblems. So these are all gestures that are made, a palm up gesture in particular, that are made in various sign languages. But I think it's possible for all of us to interpret the meaning of these hand gestures because they are emblems. They are conventionalized to a certain extent. So I would assume that this particular type of gesture is borrowed from the ambient culture, but it is included in sign language. It is included within the signing stream. So gestures are also part of sign language. Now we move on to diversity. In what ways are sign languages different? So I think that what is new about this work and work of many of my colleagues is that we're now focusing more on the diversity, on the things that are different about sign languages, and yet that sign languages all have in common with each other. So they're important. And these are some of them. Iconicity versus arbitrariness at all levels. So in sign languages, many expressions look like what they mean. And in spoken language, even though there is iconicity, it's much less common. Also, in sign languages, there's an overt relation between the body articulations and linguistic functions, as we will see very shortly. Simultaneity versus linearity. So spoken languages are typically linear at all levels of structure because of the nature of the medium, but it's a fact that spoken languages are linear, both in their phonological form, morphological form, and in their syntactic form. And also, whereas in sign languages, there's much more simultaneity, which I will demonstrate. And finally, the non-linguistic gestures of spoken language are typically visual, and in that sense are in a different physical system than the rest of language. Whereas in sign languages, the gestures exploit the same visual system, as we will see. So I think that I have a whole paper showing that not all gestures are manual in spoken language, but we'll put that aside for now because most of them are, and that's what we're used to. So how are sign languages different? Well, in contemporary spoken languages, the relationship between form and meaning is mostly arbitrary. So book in English is book, in French it's livre, in Hebrew it's sefer, and in Arabic it's kitab. And all of these concepts, cat, eat, and drive all have arbitrary forms, not iconic forms in spoken languages. But in sign languages, you can see here that these forms are quite iconic. So book mirrors the opening of a book, cat, whiskers, eat, putting something in your mouth, and driving, moving the steering wheel. So these are just some examples, but trust me, there's a lot of iconicity in sign language as opposed to spoken language. So this, I think, is a concrete difference. It's an important difference. I said that sign language linguistic functions correspond to visible articulations of different parts of the body. And I'm only going to give you one example because it shows that it's not only the hands that are linguistically employed in sign language. So here we have 3 different signers describing the same Tweety cartoon in which Sylvester the cat is falling through the air holding the Tweety bird. And they all use a conventionalized mouth shape that has an adverbial function. So the mouth shape means for a long time. These are just some of the ways in which different articulators convey linguistic functions in sign language. I'll give you a moment to just look at that. I won't go through them all. Instead, we're going to go back to that complex sentence with the relative clause, and we're going to break it down into its parts. Here's the sentence. Okay, hands. That's not a surprise that the hands are important. The hands convey lexical items such as dog and escape. At the prosodic level, the head is very important. It can distinguish the topic phrase, the small dog that I found last week, by having the head move forward and down, which is systematic, from the comment phrase in the sentence, in which there's a very salient change in the head position. What that change is depends on the nature of the comment. At the prosodic level, we also have the face. Now, the face conveys intonation in sign language, and the meanings are simultaneously compositional. So for example, brow raise indicates continuation, something like high tone in spoken language, and squint in Israeli Sign Language indicates shared information. But the two can and do co-occur in this relative clause to indicate a continuation to the rest of the sentence, and shared information, which is the relative clause, the dog that we both know about. Finally, at the discourse level, the torso comes into the picture, and we see torso shifts. Now, this same sentence is a discourse in itself because it was elicited in isolation. So bear with me, and we'll think of it as a discourse now. And we can see that the torso shifts from the topic phrase to the comment phrase. And this kind of shift, torso shift, is active also at higher levels of discourse. Finally, the two hands. Now, the two hands can be together in a sign, such as just then, but they can also be separated and act independently. So that the non-dominant hand can be a discourse continuity marker. In this case, it marks a small dog, and it stays present in the whole stretch of discourse until the small dog is no longer the topic. Let's put it all together. Here it is again, now that you know what to look for in slow motion. Okay, I talked about simultaneity, and we saw one example in facial expression, but there's also simultaneity in syntax, whereas in spoken language, syntax has to be linear. So for example, in a setting, for example, context in which we're at the museum and we're looking at a painting, we can say, while I looked at a painting, someone walked over beside me. Now this is one simultaneous event, but we have no choice but to convey it linearly in two clauses. Also, I looked at the person as she walked over beside me. Spoken language requires us to lay those two events, those two simultaneous events out linearly. I asked her, what do you want? But in sign language, again, we have two hands. So the two hands can simultaneously behave syntactically in such situations where we want to convey one simultaneous event that has two parts to it using the two hands. This is presented at 50% of normal speed, and the signer is signing exactly the same sentences that are written on the screen. Here goes. It's so efficient that you wonder why we don't do it, that we don't all do it. What's happening, you can see here that each hand conveys a different referent, and for this reason, we can convey different parts of the same event simultaneously in sign language. Moving to gesture, I showed you gestures that were emblems that were borrowed from the spoken ambient language, but there are also gestures in sign language which are unique to sign languages. So this is an example of a spoken language gesture. This is my friend who was describing a Charlie Chaplin movie, and she said the bar that locks the cage falls, and she made this iconic gesture at the same time. And this is kind of a classic iconic gesture in spoken language. But sign language has its own kind of gestures, in addition to those emblems which occur occasionally, the palm up emblems that we saw. In particular, sign languages use the mouth for gestures. And in some papers that I've written, I've explained why we can call them gestures comfortably and not call them words or signs. Let's look for a moment at this cartoon. And how does the signer describe this? Watch his mouth. Now, in some of my work, I have explained why these elements, these mouth gestures are gestures and not linguistic elements. They're idiosyncratic. People can use the same gesture to mean different things. All the criteria that McNeil put forward for gestures are characteristic of these mouth gestures in sign language, and I've seen these gestures in American Sign Language and German Sign Language too, and also in the Al-Sayed Bedouin Sign Language, the village sign language that my colleagues and I have been studying for many years. So you see a mouth gesture that indicates here water spraying out from a tap. So this is a very, very common feature of sign languages, which means that all languages have to have imagistic gestures which accompany the linguistic stream, but sign languages find their own way to do it, namely with the mouth. So what I want to say is that sign languages are not just the marginal purview of deaf populations. Sign languages belong to all of us. So you and me, if we didn't happen to have auditory input, we would create a sign language with all of these characteristics. And this slide I put together on an impulse, but I actually love it because it tells a big story. Some of the sign languages here are community sign languages that belong to large communities such as Britain, the United States, and Korea, also Israel, in the sense that it's also a community-wide sign language. But all the other sign languages pictured here are village sign languages that arose simply because there were a number of deaf people that had an opportunity to get together often enough to create a linguistic system. So we all have it. The point is that we all have it in us to make a sign language. So these are some of the universal characteristics which I've mentioned. These are some so-called diverse characteristics that distinguish spoken language from sign language. And from this, my conclusion is as follows. Diversity in a complex system like language does not merely reveal variations that just happen to occur. It shows how elastic our cognitive capabilities are. And I think that this elasticity is an enormous advantage for our species. And I would hope that, that this idea would spawn further research on different, on diversity as a kind of elasticity in humans and in comparisons to other species. And I thank all these people and funders for their help.
So, as before, if you have any questions in person, you can come to the microphone. If you have any other questions on the chat, you can just type them in.
Uh-oh.
So, if nobody has, oh, yeah, there's somebody coming down. 1 second.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting talk. I learned a lot. I wanted to ask, now that you spoke of how prosody is conveyed through head movements and some facial gestures. Yeah. If you know stuff, for example, in the clinical literature that points to prosody defects, like, you know, in normal language, you know, you may have a lesion on the right side of the brain that conveys difficulty to convey prosody. So I was curious about evidence in how that would manifest in sign language.
That's a great question. I'm not an expert on the brain and sign language. The early studies on brain and sign language showed that classic deficits like Broca's and Wernicke's deficits affected the same part of the brain in sign language, which is pretty interesting. But later research has shown that there's much more diversity in the way the brain is organized for sign language. So the predictions are clear, right? That we would want to see, we'd want to see what's affected in the brain by different sorts of deficits. And I can't answer that question. I refer you to Karen Emery and David Carina, who've done a lot of work on brain and sign language. I don't know if they've looked at prosody. That's a great idea for future research.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the great talk.
So we have a question from Shelly Xia from the chat, and she's asking, do we take into account the history of the two types of languages?
Yes. But could you follow up on that? Do you have any predictions? We definitely take into our findings are that sign languages develop gradually. They don't spring forth full blown with all the linguistic characteristics that we find in more established sign languages. But did you want to ask something specific?
She's not following up on it, but I have another one from the chat. So Jenny Culberson is asking, basically saying, great talk, Wendy. I was interested in what you said about this being something that we all have in us to create. What about learning? Do you think this tells us something about our flexibility to learn?
Absolutely, because all the evidence from deaf children with deaf parents, where they have the same kind of input that hearing children have, which is only about 10% of the deaf population. They acquire language without explicit instruction through interaction on the same timetable as hearing children. So yes, we can do that the same way.
Well, thank you so very much. We are moving on to the next virtual speaker. Thank you, Wendy.